The iterative approach in Agile teams, creating maximum agility in technical documentation. So what's the iterative approach? At its simplest, the iterative planning process appears as a cycle of agreement, execution, and assessment. So instead of a project being undertaken with a finite goal, iterative development assumes there will be many small goals achieved with a repeatable cyclic process. This approach is used by Agile teams to meet consecutive deadlines, and the iterative approach is used in place of traditional waterfall documentation. In other words, this is not just one project. So traditionally, we would have one project, we would go start to finish, and the documentation will be all done at the end, and that documentation will be subject to revision history carved in stone. Under the iterative approach, documentation is more organic. If you think of software iterations, for example, new software is coming out all the time, so there is no end goal. We are just constantly improving. Therefore, the documentation must move along with that approach in an agile way. So if we talk about waterfall documentation, which was the traditional way to document things, like in manufacturing workflows, it's a sequential design process. So if you think of it as 8 stages: conception, initiation, analysis, all the way through to troubleshooting, everything had to be completed, and then they would move on to the next step, or more traditionally, the next project. There were some advantages, and there are some advantages to the waterfall methodology. It does require careful record keeping, and that allows for the ability to improve upon the existing program in the future. The client, of course, knows what to expect. Here's what the end product will be, and they have a definite idea of what they get from that end product. Another strength of waterfall methodology is that if key employees would leave, there was minimal project impact. So in other words, when you have one document or a documentation that is the source of truth, that documentation can be utilized by people that come into your company with very little variance. In contrast, we talk about agile documentation, which is becoming more and more popular given the wave of technology, or the fact that technology changes very quickly in modern business. So in lieu of sequential design process, the agile methodology follows an incremental approach, or an iterative approach. From a simplistic project design, work is done in limited iteration. These modules are done in weekly or monthly sprints, and then at the end of each of these weekly or monthly sprints, the project priorities are evaluated and tests are run. Once this evaluation testing has taken place, a new iterative cycle is begun. So when you think about iterative approach, you want to think of cycles. This process, with its lack of initial design and steps, so in other words, there's not a lot of pre-thinking loaded into it, is often criticized for its collaborative nature, and it focuses more on principles rather than process. And in a way that's different from the waterfall approach, employee turnover can be an obstacle. So because this documentation is not as set in stone, it's fluid, and if you have employees coming and going, it's difficult to understand exactly where one employee left off and where the next one should start. Some advantages of the Agile methodology: it allows for changes to be made after initial planning. So I make a plan, but this allows me to be able to be more free to make changes, and in fact, that is really what Agile methodology is based on. Because it allows you to make these changes, it's easier to add features that will keep you up to date with the latest developments in your industry. And once again, if I use the software example, because it's an obvious example, software is changing all the time. You have to update all the time, and therefore your ability to document what has happened needs to be agile. At the end of each iteration, project priorities are evaluated. This also allows clients to add their feedback so that they ultimately get the product they desire. So under the waterfall methodology, here's what your product is going to be. We'll build it from inception to completion, this is what you get. Under the Agile methodology, we start building it. If you change what you want, or you find a better idea, or a better idea presents itself to the project team, then the end product can be changed on the fly. The testing at the end of each iteration ensures that issues are realized and taken care of in the development cycle. So one advantage of Agile methodology is it allows you to evaluate much more quickly and much more often. Because the products are tested so thoroughly with Agile, the product can be launched at the end of any iteration. As a result, it's more likely to reach its launch date. In other words, it's tested, it is, for lack of a better phrase, good enough to work, and so you can launch it and then make improvements on the go. Once again, think of a cycle. Some requirements for Agile documentation. The documentation is continuous, ensures that a large amount of documentation is written, reviewed, and delivered when needed. So documentation is always on the go. It's a moving target, so it has its challenges. And that's one reason that version history or revision history is so very important, because you need to look back and see where you have come from to kind of give you an idea about where you are going. Feedback is vital, and feedback from many different parties is vital to ensure that your documentation is accurate. So some of the principles for proper Agile documentation. Documentation must be embedded as part of the Agile process. So in other words, it can't be apart from the project itself. Everyone has to contribute to the documentation effort because things are changing so quickly. It requires everyone's input. It requires a manager for the documentation process, so someone must be the overall manager for the process itself. Tech writers need to have an understanding of technical documentation. And everyone must be integrated. Collaboration by all interested parties is key to proper Agile documentation.